My name is Renee Castellano, and I'm 33 years old. I'm a veterinary surgeon, and on the night before Thanksgiving, I sat alone in the dark of my own home office with a folder in my lap, waiting for my parents and my brother to walk through a door I had already decided to open for them. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the maples along Birchwood Lane, and somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at nothing, and I sat very still in my desk chair with my coat still on, because I hadn't bothered to take it off since I got home from the clinic 3 hours earlier. My phone was face down on the desk, beside a mug of coffee that had gone cold a long time ago, and every few minutes it would buzz against the wood, and I would glance at the screen just long enough to see my mother's name and then turn it back over without answering. I had let 6 calls go to voicemail that day. 6. I know, because I counted them the way I count everything now, the way my grandmother taught me to count a column of numbers until it finally told me the truth instead of a story. I want to tell you who I am before I tell you what was in that folder, because if you only hear the ending, you'll think I was born hard, and I wasn't. I grew up in Ashford Falls, a town small enough that everyone at the grocery store knew whose daughter you were before you said a word. My father, Walter, worked at the regional bank for almost 30 years, and my mother, Denise, kept our house so clean you could have performed surgery on the kitchen floor. I have one sibling, my younger brother Dominic, 3 years behind me, and from the time I was old enough to understand what a hockey rink was, I understood that Dominic was the reason our family existed. That's not an exaggeration, that's just the shape of the house I grew up in. There was Dominic, and then there was everyone else arranged around him like furniture. I was folding a stack of surgical consent forms on my desk that Wednesday evening, not because I needed to, but because my hands wanted something to do, while my mind sorted through everything I now knew and everything I still had to prove. The folder sitting closed in front of me held copies of a property lien document, a signature that was supposed to be mine but wasn't, and a letter written in my grandmother's careful, looping hand that I had read so many times the creases were starting to soften. I had read that letter for the first time 3 weeks earlier, sitting on the floor of my grandmother's empty house, and by the time I finished it, I understood 2 things with total clarity. The first was that my grandmother, Vivian Castellano, had seen exactly who my parents were for my entire life, and had never once said a word about it out loud, choosing instead to build something quiet and patient behind the scenes that she hoped I would find when I finally needed it. The second was that I was going to need it very, very soon. The headlights came around the corner at 6:40, sweeping across my living room ceiling in a long, slow arc before they went dark in my driveway. I heard 3 car doors, not 2, which told me Dominic had come along after all, exactly the way I'd expected him to, because Dominic never misses a moment when there's something to be gained from showing up. I heard my mother's voice first, that particular bright, performative warmth she reserves for occasions when she wants an audience to believe everything is fine, calling out something about how cozy the porch light looked, how she'd always loved this street. I heard my father say almost nothing, which was also exactly what I expected, because my father has spent his entire life saying almost nothing, while other people made the decisions that would eventually cost me everything. I did not get up to answer the door right away. I sat there in the dark for another moment, my hand resting flat on the folder the way you'd rest your hand on something you needed to keep steady, and I let myself feel the weight of what was about to happen, instead of rushing past it the way I usually do. 21 years I had spent making myself small enough to fit into whatever space this family left over after Dominic took what he needed. 21 years of watching resources, attention, and love flow in one direction while I learned, quietly and thoroughly, how to need nothing from anyone. And now, on the one night I had chosen deliberately, on the one night I had built with the same patience my grandmother had taught me without ever meaning to teach me, they were about to walk into a house that still, on paper, said it belonged to someone else, not because I had lost it, because they had tried to take it. The doorbell rang, and I heard my mother's voice again, muffled through the wood, saying something about the cold, something about how good it would be for all of us to sit down together, like a real family for once. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest for exactly 3 seconds, the way you hold something right before you decide you're strong enough to set it down on a table in front of people who never once thought you'd fight back. Then I stood, smoothed the front of my coat, and walked toward the front hall, my footsteps even and unhurried on the hardwood, because Detective Aaron Michaels had told me 2 days earlier, sitting across from me in a small gray room at the county station, that the calmest person in a room is always the one holding the real power, whether anyone else in that room realizes it yet or not. I opened the door, and there they were, on my porch, in the porch light, my mother in her good wool coat with a casserole dish balanced against her hip, like she'd never once considered that I might not want it in my house. My father a half step behind her, with his hands jammed into his coat pockets, and his eyes already sliding away from mine toward the doorframe, and Dominic standing slightly apart from both of them, the way he always does, close enough to be counted as family, but far enough to avoid whatever consequences might be coming. My mother smiled at me, the wide, warm smile she uses when she wants something, and she said, "Renee, honey, we're so glad you finally said yes to this." And behind her, past her shoulder, I could see straight through my own front hall to the dining room table, where I had already set 3 extra places, and where, sitting quietly with a leather folio of his own, waited a man none of them had expected to see. A man who had driven 2 hours that afternoon at my request, and who was about to change the entire shape of this family's Thanksgiving. I stepped back from the doorway and held it open. "Come in," I said, and my voice did not shake, not even a little, because I had spent 21 years learning how to sound calm while everything inside me screamed. And tonight, for the first time in my life, that calm belonged entirely to me. My mother crossed the threshold first, still smiling, still certain she knew exactly how this evening was going to go, and I watched her eyes travel toward the dining room, toward the stranger seated at my table, and I watched the smile begin, very slightly, to falter. To understand why I sat in that dark office waiting for my own family like they were strangers I needed to be ready for, you have to go back to the house I grew up in on Larkspur Court, a tidy brick colonial with a 2-car garage that somehow, no matter how many times my father added onto it, never had room for my things. I was 7 years old the first time I understood, really understood, that my brother and I were not being raised the same way. Dominic was 4, and he had just been signed up for his first youth hockey league, and the entire kitchen table that winter disappeared under a landslide of equipment catalogs, my mother circling skates and pads with a red pen the way other mothers circled coupons. I remember standing at the edge of that table, trying to find a spot to set down my library books, and my mother, without even looking up, said, "Not now, Renee. We're busy with your brother's registration." And I took my books and went and sat on the stairs instead. And that became, without either of us ever naming it, exactly where I belonged in that house. Not at the table, near it, but not at it. There is one memory I return to more than any other, and it is not dramatic, which is somehow what makes it worse. I was 10 years old and I had spent 6 weeks building a diorama for a school project, a scale model of the Ashford Falls watershed, complete with a working drip system I'd rigged from an old aquarium pump, and I was so proud of it that I carried it to the kitchen table the night before it was due, just to look at it one more time under good light. My mother came in from the garage where she'd been organizing Dominic's gear bags for a tournament 3 states away, took one look at the model on her table and said, without any particular unkindness in her voice, just a flat, tired practicality, "Honey, we really need this table clear for the drive tomorrow. Can you move that somewhere else?" I carried it down to the basement and set it on the cold concrete floor next to the water heater, and the pump leaked overnight, and by morning half the model had warped and sagged in on itself, and I remember standing in the doorway of the basement in my school clothes, looking at what 6 weeks of work had turned into, and understanding with a clarity most 10-year-olds don't have that this wasn't an accident of circumstance. This was simply what happened to the things that belonged to me in that house. They got moved to make room for Dominic, and sometimes what got moved didn't survive the move. My father was not cruel, not in any way you could point to and call abuse. He was simply absent in the specific way that men become absent when they've decided one child is the investment and the other is the overhead. He drove 4 hours round trip most weekends to sit in cold rinks watching Dominic's games, filming them on a camcorder he kept charged and ready by the front door like a fireman's gear, and I don't have a single memory of him at my science fairs, my track meets, my 8th grade graduation, which I walked across a stage for while he and my mother and Dominic were somewhere in Vermont for a hockey showcase. I remember asking my mother once, I must have been 12, why Dominic got new equipment every single season when mine from 2 years earlier still fit fine. And she looked at me with an expression I've spent 2 decades trying to name, something between pity and irritation, and said, Renee, you don't need things the way your brother does. You've always been the practical one. I didn't understand until much later that being called practical in that house was not a compliment. It was a life sentence. It meant I had been sorted, filed, and closed. The financial shape of it became impossible to ignore by the time I was in high school. My father took out what he called a small loan against the house to cover a private skills camp for Dominic that cost more than my entire junior year of extracurriculars combined. And when I brought home a full academic scholarship offer letter from the state university 2 years later, my mother read it over my shoulder at the kitchen counter, said, That's wonderful, sweetheart, in the same tone she used for weather forecasts, and then turned immediately to ask my father whether Dominic's new coach had called back yet about the fall schedule. I stood there holding that acceptance letter, 16 years of quiet accumulation crystallizing into one single moment, and I understood that no accomplishment of mine was ever going to register in that house as loudly as a phone call about my brother's practice schedule. So I stopped trying to make it register. I got very good, very fast, at not needing anyone in that kitchen to notice me at all. The one person who did notice, who noticed everything, was my grandmother, Vivian, my father's mother, who lived 20 minutes away in a small yellow farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a garden she tended with a ferocity that seemed to increase every year she got older. Every Sunday afternoon that Dominic had a game, which was most Sundays, my parents would leave me at Grandma Vivian's on their way to the rink, and what started as an inconvenient arrangement for them became, over the years, the only place I ever felt like a whole person instead of a problem to be managed. She taught me to snap beans on that porch, and to balance her checkbook out loud, calling out the numbers the way you'd call out a hymn, and she never once made me feel like I was the leftover child being dropped off so the real family could go do the real thing. She used to say, stirring something on her old gas stove with her back to me, not even looking over her shoulder, Numbers don't play favorites, Renee. People do. You remember the difference. I didn't understand at 10 what she meant. I understood it completely by the time I was 17, and I understood it in a way that would take on an entirely different weight 16 years later, sitting in the dark of my own home office with a folder on my lap, waiting for a door to open. I left for veterinary school the fall after I turned 18, with 2 duffel bags, a used Honda I'd bought with 3 summers of kennel work money, and a goodbye from my mother that consisted of her handing me a Tupperware of leftover casserole and saying, "Call when you get there so we know you didn't total the car," while my father stood in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, and Dominic, 17, and already being scouted by 2 junior league teams, didn't come outside at all. Grandma Vivian was the only one who drove the 3 hours to help me move into my dorm, and she stayed the whole weekend making my bed in hospital corners and hanging a small framed photo of the 2 of us on my wall before she left. And in the car on the way to drop her at the bus station, she reached over and put her hand on my knee and said something I carried with me for the next 15 years without ever fully understanding it. "You're going to build something they can't take credit for," she said, watching the road instead of me. "And when the day comes that they try to take it anyway, you come find me first." I laughed it off at the time, told her nobody was trying to take anything from me, that I barely had a car worth stealing. She just nodded slowly, patted my knee once, and looked back out the window, And I would not understand what she meant until 15 years later, standing alone in her empty farmhouse kitchen, holding a small wooden box with my name written across the top in her careful, looping hand. Vet school nearly broke me financially before it built me into anyone at all. I took out loans that made my hands shake when I signed the paperwork, worked overnight shifts at an emergency animal clinic through my second and third years, just to cover rent on a studio apartment above a laundromat, where the dryers ran until midnight, and I learned to sleep through the rumble like it was a lullaby. I want to be honest about those years, because I think people hear veterinary surgeon now and picture something that arrived easily, and it did not arrive easily. Not one single piece of it. I remember standing in the clinic parking lot at 4 in the morning after a 12-hour shift, so tired I couldn't feel my own feet, calling my mother because I'd had a bad week, and some small collapsing part of me still wanted to hear her voice tell me it would be okay. She picked up distracted, television murmuring behind her, and when I told her I was exhausted and scared about a surgical rotation I was terrified I'd fail, she said, "You've always been so capable, Renee. You'll figure it out." And then, without missing a beat, launched into a story about Dominic's latest tryout and how the coach had specifically mentioned his hands. I hung up that call, sat down on the curb outside the clinic in my scrubs, and made myself a promise very close to the one I'd made in that basement doorway years earlier, looking at my ruined diorama. I promised myself I would build something so solid, so entirely my own, that no one would ever again get to decide whether it deserved a place on the table. I graduated fourth in my class, with a debt load that took my breath away every time I looked at the total, and I did not go home to celebrate. My mother sent flowers to the ceremony, a nice enough arrangement, but she and my father were 3 states away at a hockey combine. Dominic had aged out of amateur eligibility for the year before, and was now trying, at 23, to parlay into some kind of coaching or scouting career that never quite materialized into anything with a steady paycheck. Grandma Vivian was in the 3rd row of that auditorium, 81 years old, wearing a blue dress she'd bought special for the occasion, and she stood up and clapped so hard and so long after they called my name that the woman next to her had to gently touch her arm to let her know she could sit back down. Afterward, she took my hand in both of hers in the lobby, her grip still strong despite the tremor that had started creeping into it that year, and she said, "Your grandfather would have loved to see this. I love seeing this. Don't you ever let anyone in that family tell you what this cost you." I didn't fully understand the weight in that sentence at the time. I understand it now. I took a position at a mixed animal practice 2 hours from Ashford Falls, in a town called Millbrook that reminded me a little of the life I'd always wanted. Quiet streets, working farms on the outskirts, people who judged you by whether you showed up at 3 in the morning for a difficult calving and not by what car you drove. Within 4 years, I had saved enough, scraped and sacrificed and refused every unnecessary expense to buy out the retiring owner and take the practice fully into my own name. I remember sitting in the closing attorney's office, signing document after document, and at the very bottom of the stack, the deed of ownership. My hand actually paused over the paper for a moment, because some old, tired part of me kept waiting for someone to walk in and tell me there wasn't room for this, that I needed to move it somewhere else to clear the table for something more important. Nobody walked in. I signed my name, Renee Castellano, sole owner, and I drove home that night and sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes just breathing. Because for the first time in my entire life something had my name on it, and nobody else's, and nobody could quietly hand it away while I wasn't looking. It was around that same time I met Owen, a large animal feed supplier who I'd started running into constantly on farm calls. A broad-shouldered, steady man who talked slow and thought slower, which is to say he thought things all the way through before he said them, which after a lifetime of my family speaking in half-truths and quick reassignments felt like the most restful thing I'd ever experienced. Our first real conversation happened at 3 in the morning in a barn stall, both of us up to our elbows helping a heifer through a breech birth. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, he looked over at me, exhausted and covered in more than either of us wanted to think about, and said, "You're good at this because you don't panic." "Where'd you learn to not panic?" I told him the truth, or the beginning of it, that I'd grown up learning nobody was coming to help, so I'd better learn to help myself. He didn't try to fix that sentence or make it smaller than it was. He just nodded and said, "Well, I'm here now, if you ever want to test that theory." And something about the plainness of it, the total absence of performance, made me trust him faster than I'd ever trusted anyone outside of my grandmother. We married 2 years later in the side yard of Grandma Vivian's farmhouse, under a maple tree that had been there since before my father was born. 30 guests, most of them from Millbrook, a handful from Ashford Falls, though my parents and Dominic sat together at the edge of the small gathering the entire evening looking. I remember thinking even in the middle of my own wedding, like people waiting for an event more important than this one to start. My father gave a short, stiff toast that mentioned my accomplishments in the vaguest possible terms, successful in her field, and Dominic, 26 by then, and between one failed business venture and the beginning of another, spent most of the reception on his phone. Grandma Vivian, 84 and moving slower now, sat in the front row the entire ceremony with tears sliding freely down her face, and afterwards she pulled Owen aside, gripped his forearm with both hands, and said something to him I only learned about years later, when he finally told me. She'd said, "You take care of what she's built. She built it alone because nobody else would, and that kind of building leaves scars nobody sees." Owen told me he promised her he would, and he has kept that promise every single day since, quietly, without ever once needing me to thank him for it out loud. By the time I turned 32, I had a practice with 6 employees, a modest but steady savings account I checked with something close to disbelief every few months, because the number kept being real, and a marriage built on the kind of honesty I'd never once witnessed growing up in that house on Larkspur Court. Meanwhile, Dominic's business ventures had piled up like a landfill, a hockey training academy that folded within 18 months, a sports supplement line that never made it past a garage full of unsold inventory, a coaching consultancy that consisted mostly of a website and a truck he'd leased with money my parents co-signed for. Every time one of these collapsed, my mother would call to tell me about it in the careful, sanitized language of someone describing weather, rather than a pattern, and every time, without fail, she would end the call the same way. "You've always been so responsible, Renee. I don't worry about you the way I worry about him." I used to hear that sentence and feel something close to relief, mistaking it for a kind of peace. It took a hospital bed, a folder, and a wooden box with my grandmother's handwriting on the lid before I finally understood that being the one nobody worried about had never meant I was safe. It had only ever meant I was next. Grandma Vivian's decline started slowly, and then all at once, the way I imagine most declines do, though nothing about watching it happen to her felt slow at the time. It began with small things her neighbor mentioned to my father, almost in passing, the mail piling up a day or two longer than usual, a stove burner left on that. Thankfully nobody had noticed until the smell of scorched metal drifted out the kitchen window. By the spring I turned 33, she had moved into a small assisted living apartment 8 minutes from Millbrook, close enough that I could visit on my lunch break, which I did nearly every day, sometimes just for 15 minutes, to sit with her and let her tell me the same 3 stories about my grandfather that she'd been telling me since I was 7, and I never once got tired of hearing them, because every time she told them her eyes did the same thing, lighting up like she was standing in that memory, instead of just describing it. It was on one of those lunch break visits, a gray Tuesday in April, that she reached over from her recliner and took my hand with a grip that surprised me with how firm it still was, and she said, "Renee, I need you to listen to me and not argue with me for once in your life." I laughed a little, told her I never argued with her, and she gave me a look that told me she was not in the mood for that particular joke. "There's a box," she said, "at the house, in the bottom drawer of my sewing desk, under the good scissors. When I'm gone, I want you to go get it yourself. Not your father. Not your mother. You. And I want you to promise me you won't let anyone else be in the room when you open it." I asked her what was in it, the way you ask a question you already suspect you won't get a real answer to, and she just patted my hand and said, "Things you'll need to know when I'm gone. Promise me." I promised her, the way I would have promised her the moon if she'd asked for it, and she settled back into her chair with something that looked almost like relief crossing her face. And we went back to talking about my grandfather's old truck, and I let myself believe, the way you let yourself believe things you desperately want to be true, that we had years left for stories like that one. We did not have years. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, the assisted living facility called to say she'd had a stroke overnight and that I should come as quickly as I could. I broke every speed limit on the drive over, and by the time I reached her room, she was awake, one side of her face pulled down like wax that had started to melt. But her eyes found me the second I walked through the door, and they were still sharp, still entirely hers. I took her hand and told her not to talk, to save her strength, all the useless things people say in that moment, because the silence feels unbearable otherwise, and she squeezed my fingers hard enough to make me stop talking and listen. "The box," she said, the words coming out slow and bent but unmistakable. "Promise me," I told her. I remembered that I promised that I would go get it myself the moment I could. She looked at me a long moment, and the working half of her mouth pulled into something that wanted very badly to be a smile, and she said one more thing before the nurse came in to check her monitor, and the moment slipped away into the quiet, clinical business of the next several hours. She said, "Good. Now they can't ration you anymore." I didn't understand the word ration in that context. Not fully, not yet. I would understand it completely within the month. She died 4 days later, in her sleep, with me sitting in the chair beside her bed, because I hadn't left the building in 3 days, and Owen had been driving down every evening after his own long day, just to sit with both of us in that small quiet room. My parents came exactly once during those 4 days, stayed 40 minutes, and my mother spent most of that visit on her phone in the hallway because Dominic was, according to her, having some kind of emotional crisis about a business deal falling through and needed her guidance. My father sat in the corner of the room and said almost nothing, the same way he'd said almost nothing my entire childhood, and when they left he squeezed my shoulder once on his way out and told me to call if anything changed, and I remember thinking, watching them walk down that hallway together, that I had spent my entire life waiting for a version of my parents who showed up, and that version simply did not exist, had perhaps never existed, and that the only person who had ever truly shown up for me without condition was lying in the bed behind me, breathing slower with every hour that passed. The funeral was small, exactly the way Grandma Vivian would have wanted it, held at the little church she'd attended for 60 years, a handful of her old friends from the garden club, 2 nurses from the assisted living facility who had genuinely grown fond of her, Owen standing beside me the entire time with his hand steady on my back. My parents came, in appropriate black, accepting condolences with the practiced ease of people who had spent a lifetime performing composure at other people's expense. Dominic arrived 20 minutes late in a rumpled shirt, checked his phone twice during the eulogy I gave, and left almost immediately after the reception without staying to help fold a single chair. I stood at the door thanking neighbors who had known Grandma Vivian for 6 decades, and I noticed, the way you notice things when grief has scraped you raw enough to see clearly, my mother pulling my father aside near the coat rack, and I caught just enough of the conversation to hear the word estate and the word house, spoken in the particular hushed, calculating tone I recognized instantly from 25 years of listening to my parents discuss anything they considered an opportunity. 3 days after the funeral, I drove out to the yellow farmhouse alone, exactly the way I had promised her I would, and I let myself in with the key I'd carried on my keychain since I was 17. The house smelled like her, like lavender and old paper and the particular dust of a home that had been lived in by one careful person for 50 years, and I stood in the front hallway for a long moment before I could make myself walk toward the sewing room. The desk was exactly where she'd said it would be, and the bottom drawer, when I opened it, held her good scissors sitting on top of a folded piece of felt, and beneath that felt, a small wooden box with brass hinges gone soft with age, and my name, Renee, written across the lid in her careful, looping hand. I carried it to the kitchen table, the same table she used to teach me to snap beans on, and I sat down in the chair I'd always sat in as a child. And I opened the lid slowly, the way you open something you already suspect is going to change the entire shape of your life, and inside I found photographs, bank statements, a folded legal document with a notary stamp, and, resting on top of all of it, a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in the same careful hand, and I sat there in that quiet kitchen for a long time before I could make myself pick it up and break the seal. I read that letter 3 times before I could make myself set it down, and I have it memorized now, though I keep the original folded in the same soft creases she left it in. My dear Renee, it began, and if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm finally able to tell you the things I should have said out loud a long time ago, instead of tucking them into a drawer under my sewing scissors like they were something shameful. She wrote that she had watched, for over 2 decades, the exact way my parents divided their attention and their resources in that house, and that she had told herself for years it wasn't her place to interfere in how her son raised his children, and that she regretted that silence every single day she carried it. I couldn't undo what they did to you while you were young, she wrote, so I did the only other thing I could think of. I started keeping what they threw away, including the truth. She explained that a portion of money meant for both grandchildren equally, seated by her and by a small trust from my grandfather's side of the family, had been quietly redirected over the years, almost entirely toward Dominic's equipment, camps, and eventually his failed business ventures, while my share sat mostly untouched because nobody in that house had ever thought to spend anything on me. She had watched it happen, documented it as best she could through bank records she had every right to as a contributor, and finally, 3 years before her stroke, moved her own house and her own savings into a trust with my name on it as sole beneficiary, specifically so that no one, she wrote, would ever again get to decide what I deserved. I'm not leaving you this so you'll be rich, Renee, she wrote near the bottom of the page, her handwriting starting to loosen the way it always did when she was tired. I'm leaving it to you, so you never again have to sit at their table and wonder if you're allowed to be there. You earned your seat the day you were born. They're the ones who forgot. I sat in that kitchen with the letter in my lap for a long time before I finally called the number written on the business card tucked beneath the bank statements. A lawyer named Grace Whitcomb, who had apparently handled my grandmother's affairs for the last several years without a single person in my family knowing she existed. Grace's office was above a bakery in downtown Millbrook, small and orderly, and when I sat down across from her desk 2 days later, she slid a folder toward me before I'd even finished explaining who I was. Your grandmother was very specific, she told me, and very organized. She wanted you to understand everything before anyone else had the chance to explain it to you their way. The estate was not enormous by any grand measure, but to a woman still paying off veterinary school loans it was a different sky entirely. The farmhouse itself, a savings account fed steadily for 2 decades, and, tucked into the folder Grace slid across that desk, a clause she said she had drafted exactly the way my grandmother requested, a no-contest provision that would strip any beneficiary of their share entirely if they attempted to challenge the will. In 15 years of practice, Grace told me, adjusting her glasses, I've only written that clause a handful of times. Your grandmother seemed to expect a fight. I did not have to wait long to understand why she expected one. The calls started less than a week after the funeral, my mother's name lighting up my phone with a frequency it had not carried in years, and when I finally answered, her voice came through warm and syrupy in a way I hadn't heard directed at me since I was small enough to still believe it meant something. Renee, honey, I've been thinking about you so much, she said. Losing Grandma really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Life's too short for all this distance between us. She talked for several minutes about regrets, about wanting a fresh start, about family being what truly mattered in the end, and I stood in my own kitchen holding the phone away from my ear slightly, the way you hold something that's giving off a smell you don't trust, and I let her talk herself all the way to the point, because I had learned a long time ago that people revealing their own agenda need very little encouragement to keep going. "We want to have everyone over," she finally said. "A real family dinner. You, us, your brother. Just to put the past behind us." I told her I'd think about it, and when I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, feeling something cold settle low in my stomach, because I understood, with a clarity that surprised even me, that grief did not arrive on a schedule, and that my mother's had arrived exactly 1 week after she learned there was an estate to discuss. Dominic texted 2 days later, something I hadn't received from him in over a year, casual and probing, in a way that didn't match the silence that usually defined our relationship. "Hey," he wrote, "that farmhouse of Grandma's, is it just sitting empty now? What's it worth, you think?" I stared at that message for a long time before I typed back something vague and non-committal, and I felt the same cold settle deeper, because a question like that wasn't curiosity, it was reconnaissance, the same tone I'd caught in my mother's voice near the coat rack at the funeral, the word estate and the word house spoken low and calculating, while I stood 20 feet away pretending not to hear. I called Grace the following afternoon and told her about both conversations, and she was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line before she said, carefully, that I should keep a record of everything, dates, exact wording if I could remember it, because families who suddenly rediscover their affection at the exact moment an inheritance becomes real were, in her professional experience, rarely operating out of grief alone. "I want you to understand something, Charlotte," she said, and then caught herself and corrected to my actual name with a small laugh, a force of habit from another case. "Your estate is legally protected. The no contest clause is solid. But solid doesn't mean painless. If they want to make noise, they can make noise for months before any of it resolves." I asked her what that meant in practice, and she told me plainly that people who plan dinners like the one my mother was describing were usually planning quite a bit more than dinner. I hung up the phone that evening, sat down at my own kitchen table, the good one Owen had built with his own hands the year we married, and I thought about the wooden box still sitting on my counter, about the word ration my grandmother had used from her hospital bed, and about the particular warmth in my mother's voice, warmth I had waited my entire childhood to hear, and had finally received the exact week it became worth something. The discovery itself happened almost by accident, the way I've since learned most of these things do, arriving sideways instead of head-on. I had gone to the county recorder's office in early October to pull a survey document for the farmhouse property, something Grace needed to finalize the transfer paperwork. And while I was standing at the counter waiting for the clerk to print my copy, I asked, mostly out of habit from running my own practice's paperwork for years, whether there was any kind of alert system for property records, something that would notify an owner if a document was ever filed against a piece of land they held. The clerk, a patient woman named Ruth, who had clearly fielded this question before, told me about a free fraud alert program the county offered, where you registered your name against a parcel and received an email the moment anything at all was recorded against it. I signed up for it on the spot for the farmhouse without thinking much of it, more out of the same instinct that makes me double-check a suture line than any real suspicion, and then I signed up a second time, almost as an afterthought, for my own clinic property back in Millbrook, because Owen had been telling me for years I was too casual about paperwork given everything I'd built. I did not expect that second alert to fire within 3 weeks. It landed in my inbox on a Wednesday morning while I was scrubbed in on a routine spay, and I did not see it until I was back in my office that afternoon, peeling off my gloves, scrolling through the day's messages with the particular exhaustion that comes after a long surgical morning. The subject line was cold and clinical in a way that made my whole chest go tight the moment I understood what it said. A new document had been recorded against my clinic property. Not the farmhouse, my clinic. The one piece of property in this entire story that had never belonged to anyone but me, purchased with my own loans, my own sweat, my own name on every page of the closing paperwork 4 years earlier. I clicked into the notice with my hands not quite steady, and what I found there stopped the air in my lungs entirely. A document had been filed listing my property as collateral against a small business loan, a loan I had never applied for, never signed for, and never once heard mentioned in my life, taken out in the name of a business called Castellano Performance Group, which I would learn within the hour was the name Dominic had registered 2 months earlier for whatever his newest venture was supposed to be. I sat very still at my desk for a long time after that, the way you sit still when your body is trying to decide whether to panic or to think clearly, and I chose, deliberately, to think clearly, because I had spent my entire life being the person who did not panic, and I was not about to let that stop being true on the one day it actually mattered. I pulled up the recorded document itself through the county's public portal, and there, at the bottom of the 3rd page, was a signature that was supposed to be mine, Renee Castellano, in handwriting that was close enough to fool a stranger glancing, but wrong in the specific ways only I would notice. The loop on the C too wide, the way the E dropped below the line at the end, instead of sitting even with it. I had signed thousands of documents in my career, consent forms, surgical waivers, closing paperwork, and I know my own signature, the way I know the sound of my own voice. And this was not it. Beneath that forged signature sat a notary stamp, and a notary's own signature certifying that I had appeared in person to sign the document willingly. I had never met this notary. I had never been anywhere near where this signing supposedly took place. I called Owen first, my hands finally beginning to shake once I no longer had to hold them steady for anyone watching, and he left the feed store the moment I finished the sentence, telling me he'd be home in 20 minutes and not to call anyone else until he got there, which was not because he didn't trust me to handle it, but because he understood, the way he always understands, that some things are easier to think through out loud with someone beside you instead of alone. When he arrived, we sat together at that kitchen table he'd built, the printed copy of the forged document spread between us, and he asked me the question I had already started asking myself. Who had access to the old signed paperwork of mine? Who had spent enough time around me, growing up, to study the shape of my handwriting closely enough to fake it convincingly to a stranger's eye? The answer sat there between us without either of us needing to say it out loud, because there was only one person in this story, with both the motive and the years of familiarity required to copy my signature well enough to get it past a notary's desk, who wasn't looking closely at all. I called Grace the next morning, and I laid it all out for her the way I lay out a surgical plan, in order, without embellishment: the forged signature, the notary stamp, the business name I now knew belonged to my brother, the timing lining up almost exactly with my mother's sudden warmth, and Dominic's question about what the farmhouse might be worth. Grace was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something more careful, more precise. "Renee," she said, "this is not a family disagreement anymore. This is forgery of a legal instrument and filing a fraudulent document with the county, and those are felonies, not misunderstandings." She told me the same thing a detective would tell me almost word for word 2 days later when I sat across from Aaron Michaels in a small gray room at the county station, that the smartest thing I could do was not confront anyone yet, not tip my hand, not let a single person in my family know what I had already found, because the moment they realized I knew, they would either destroy the paper trail or scatter long enough to make prosecution difficult. "Let them think they're still ahead of you," Grace said. "Let them plan their dinner. Let them believe the story they've built in their own heads about how easily this is going to go. And in the meantime, we build ours." That night I sat at my desk long after Owen had gone to bed, going through the box from my grandmother's sewing drawer one more time under better light, and I found, tucked into a compartment beneath the bank statements I'd already read, one more document I hadn't fully examined the first time through: a copy of an old signature card from the bank, my own, From years earlier, the kind my grandmother must have quietly requested and kept as a reference sample without ever telling me why. I understood then, sitting alone in that lamplight with the forged deed on one side of my desk and my grandmother's careful, patient foresight on the other, that she had spent the last years of her life building me a shield out of paperwork, one document at a time, and that somewhere in this quiet, careful accumulation, she had already known, long before I did, exactly what my family was capable of, and exactly what proof would someday need to exist to stop them. For 6 weeks, I lived two entirely different lives at once, the one my family saw, and the one I was quietly building underneath it, and I have never worked harder at anything in my career than I worked at staying calm on the phone with my mother during that stretch of time. She called nearly every week now, warmer each time, floating the Thanksgiving dinner idea, with increasing specificity, and I let her, agreeing to dates, asking mild questions about what she wanted me to bring, playing the part of a daughter, slowly softening toward reconciliation, while Grace and Detective Michaels built a case file thick enough to end this family's version of events for good. Dominic texted twice more during those weeks, once asking outright whether I'd thought any more about the farmhouse's value, once sending a message that made my stomach turn cold when I read it, something breezy about how a big property like that really ought to stay in the family instead of sitting there for one person alone. I saved every single message with a timestamp, the way Grace had told me to. Building a folder on my phone, I labeled something boring enough that no one glancing at my screen would think twice about it. Detective Michaels walked me through the mechanics of it during our second meeting, laying it out with the same patient, methodical clarity I try to use when I explain a diagnosis to a frightened pet owner. The forged deed on my clinic, he said, was already a felony sitting on paper with Dominic's business name attached to it. But paper alone sometimes gets explained away in court. Memory disputes, confusion, a business partner taking the blame. What juries understand instantly, he told me, leaning back in his chair, is action. If your family tries to act on what they believe they've already secured, if they show up expecting to walk into something they think they now control, that's the moment the case stops being complicated and starts being simple. He asked me whether I thought there was any chance they might attempt exactly that, and I told him about the dinner invitation, about how insistent my mother had become about a specific date, about the way she kept asking, almost too casually, whether Owen and I would be traveling anywhere for the holiday. I understood, sitting in that gray room, that my mother was not planning a reconciliation dinner. She was planning to know precisely when my clinic and my house would be empty. So I let her think she'd gotten what she wanted. I told her Owen and I had decided to stay local for Thanksgiving, that we'd be around, and I heard the small, satisfied shift in her voice when I said it, the sound of a plan clicking into place on her end of the line. I agreed to the date. I agreed to host, in fact, at my own house, which seemed to please her even more than she expected it to, and I understood exactly why the moment Grace explained it to me afterwards. Hosting meant they would know I'd be there, know the house would be occupied, know exactly what time everyone was expected to arrive, and exactly how long the evening was supposed to last. It meant, in other words, that they could plan around it with confidence. What none of them knew was that I had already spent that week working with Grace to file something called a Notice of Fraudulent Instrument with the county, formally flagging the forged deed and beginning the process of unwinding it in court. A document that would sit quietly on record from that point forward, whether or not my family ever discovered it existed. What none of them knew, either, was that 2 days before Thanksgiving, I invited someone else to that dinner entirely, someone whose name was not on any guest list my mother had ever imagined, and asked him to arrive early, before anyone else, and to wait quietly at my dining room table with a folio of his own. That is where I left you at the very beginning, sitting alone in the dark of my own home office, with a closed folder in my lap, listening to 3 car doors close in my driveway instead of 2, because Dominic had come along exactly the way I'd known he would. I had already walked through every version of this evening in my head so many times that when it actually began, it felt less like a confrontation and more like watching a surgery I had already planned in detail proceed exactly according to the steps I'd laid out. I opened the door. My mother stepped through first with her casserole dish and her wide, warm smile. The smile I had spent 33 years wanting to earn and had finally understood, standing there in my own front hall, was never something I could have earned at all, because it had never been mine to earn in the first place. It was simply the face she wore whenever she believed something valuable was within reach. I watched that smile begin to falter the moment her eyes reached the dining room, the moment she saw the stranger sitting quietly at my table, with a leather folio in front of him, and I watched my father's hands come out of his coat pockets, and I watched Dominic go very still in the doorway behind both of them, the particular stillness of a man doing quick, panicked math. I stepped back and let all three of them into the front hall, closed the door behind them, and said, in a voice that did not shake, that I was so glad they could make it, that dinner would be ready soon, and that first, before we sat down to eat, there was something we needed to talk through together as a family. My mother's eyes flicked toward the man at the table again, and I watched her try to recover her smile, try to fold this unexpected presence into whatever story she'd already written for this evening, and she said, light and bright and just slightly too fast, "Renee, honey, who's your friend?" And I walked past her into the dining room, pulled out my own chair, and did not sit down in it yet, because there was one more thing I needed to say, before this family sat at a table together, for what I already knew, standing there, was going to be the last time. "This is Detective Aaron Michaels," I said, and I watched every muscle in my mother's face go rigid at once, watched my father's hand find the back of the nearest chair the way you reach for something to hold on to, watched Dominic take one full step backwards toward the front door before catching himself and stopping. "He's not here for dinner. He's here because 3 weeks ago, someone forged my signature on a deed to my clinic and used it as collateral for a business loan, and I'd like to know, in front of everyone, exactly which one of you is going to explain that to him first." The silence in that front hall stretched long enough that I could hear the furnace kick on somewhere below us, and I watched my mother's face cycle through 3 or 4 different expressions before it finally settled on something wounded and indignant, the same performance I'd watched her give at that funeral coat rack 6 weeks earlier, only now, with nowhere left for it to land. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its warmth entirely, gone thin and brittle around the edges, and beside her, my father said nothing at all, which by that point in my life I understood was its own kind of confession. Dominic, still standing half a step from the front door, found his voice first, and it came out loud and defensive in a way that told me everything I needed to know. "This is insane," he said. "You're calling the cops on your own family over paperwork?" Detective Michaels rose from his chair at the table, then, unhurried, introduced himself properly, laying out in plain, careful language exactly what had been recorded against my clinic, exactly whose signature had been forged, and exactly whose business the loan had been filed under. I watched Dominic's face go pale as the detective spoke, watched him look toward our mother the way he had looked toward her his entire life whenever something needed fixing, and for the first time in 26 years, I watched her have absolutely nothing to offer him. Grace arrived 20 minutes later, exactly when I'd asked her to, carrying a folder of her own that she laid on my dining room table, beside Detective Michael's folio, and between the two of them they walked my parents and my brother through the entire shape of what they had done. The forged signature that did not match a single sample on file with either the bank or the county, the notary who had already given a statement confirming he had never met me in his life, the business filings that traced the loan directly to an account Dominic controlled. My mother tried at one point to turn the conversation toward grief, toward how hard this year had been, toward how none of us were thinking clearly after losing Grandma Vivian, and I let her finish, the way Grace had taught me to let people finish, because the quieter I stayed, the more clearly everyone in that room could hear exactly how thin her explanation actually was. When she ran out of words, I told her, calmly, that grief did not explain a forged signature filed with the county 3 weeks after a funeral, and that if she wanted to talk about what this year had cost people, we could start with the 25 years before it. My father finally spoke then, for the first time since walking through my door, and what he said surprised me more than anything Dominic had said all evening. He looked at his hands and said, quietly, that he had known something was wrong when Dominic asked him to co-sign paperwork he hadn't been allowed to read closely, and that he had signed it anyway because he was tired of watching his son fail and had convinced himself, somehow, that this time would be different. It was, I think, the most honest sentence I had ever heard my father say in my entire life, and it did not make anything better, but it made something in me finally understand him completely. The legal process that followed moved more slowly than I expected, and faster than my family clearly hoped. Dominic was charged with forgery and filing a fraudulent instrument, both felonies, and the notary who had certified a signing that never happened lost his commission entirely and faced his own separate charges once the county's investigation widened. Dominic took a plea rather than face a jury with a forged signature comparison sitting in evidence, and the loan itself, once the fraudulent collateral was formally voided by the court, collapsed back onto him personally, meaning the debt he had tried to quietly transfer onto my clinic simply followed him home instead, along with a criminal record that closed doors his charm had always managed to pry back open before. My mother was never charged. There wasn't enough tying her hands directly to the forgery itself, only to the warmth she had used to try to keep me distracted and available while it happened. But Ashford Falls is small enough that everyone eventually learned the shape of what occurred, and the version of my family that had spent decades performing devotion for an audience finally had to sit inside the truth of what that devotion had actually cost. My father writes me now, real letters in his shaky, careful hand, the kind of letters that arrive maybe once a month, and I read every single one of them, though I have not yet found it in myself to write back. I have not thrown them away either. My mother and I do not speak, and I have made a kind of uneasy peace with that silence, the same peace I imagine my grandmother made with her own silence for all those years, choosing instead to build something quiet and patient that would eventually speak for itself. The farmhouse is mine now, fully and legally, the way Grandma Vivian intended from the very beginning, and Owen and I spend most Sunday afternoons there now, in the garden she used to tend, teaching each other the names of plants neither of us grew up knowing. I set up a small scholarship at the community college in Millbrook that spring, funded partly through her estate, for students studying veterinary or agricultural science who had grown up, as the description reads, in households where their ambitions were treated as less important than someone else's, and I read every application myself, because I understand exactly what it feels like to be the child nobody thought was worth the investment. I think about that word my grandmother used from her hospital bed more often than I expected to: ration. The way my family had spent 25 years deciding I could survive on less, because I never once made noise about wanting more. I understand now that being called capable, being called practical, being called the one nobody worries about, was never a compliment in that house. It was simply the language people use when they have already decided how much of themselves you're allowed to take. My grandmother saw that language for exactly what it was, long before I could name it myself, and she spent the last patient years of her life building a quiet, careful counterweight to it, one document at a time, so that when the moment finally came, and she seemed to know, somehow, that it would come, I would not have to stand there empty-handed the way I always had before. Family isn't the people who decide how much space you're allowed to take up at their table. It's the people who make sure, long after they're gone, if they have to, that you finally learn how to set one of your own. If you've ever been the one nobody worried about, I hope you hear this the way I finally did. That was never safe. It was just a debt they were counting on you never learning how to collect.